I told her on the first morning that I had married her for the house and not for love, and I watched the words land on her the way a late frost lands on a green thing, and she did not flinch. And that was the first sign I had picked wrong if I'd been hopping for a woman who would stay small in my kitchen and out of my heart. We were standing in the cold gray of the yard, the wagon she'd come on already rattling back toward Ostrander, and I had said my piece the way a man says a thing he has rehearsed so he won't have to feel it. I needed someone to cook and to keep the house and to see that the children were fed and washed and learned their letters. I told her, and I would give her a roof and my name and a fair share of what the place made, and she would not have to fear me, not ever, but she should not look to me for the other thing, the soft thing, because that account was closed and the ledger burned. I was 38 years old and I had buried it 3 years gone, and I did not mean to dig in that ground again. Marta Sorrel listened to all of it with her hands folded over the front of a brown traveling dress that had been mended at the cuff with thread a shade too dark, and when I had finished, she looked at me with eyes the steady color of creek water and said, "I did not come west the second time looking to be loved, Mr. Mercer. I came looking for ground to stand on." Then she picked up her own carpetbag before I could reach for it, which a woman in that country did not generally do in front of a man, and she carried it up the porch steps herself, and I stood in the yard a fool, holding out an empty hand. I have told this story to my grandchildren now more times than there are fence posts on the South Line, and they always laugh at that part, the part where their grandfather got told, and I let them laugh, because it is true, and because a man my age has earned the right to be the fool in his own telling if the telling comes out honest in the end. But I want to set it down whole for once, before my hand gets worse than it already is, because the shortest true thing I can say about my life is this. I married a woman to run my house, and she ran a green vine up the wall of a dead man and made him live again, and I never once told her, not in all the years, the size of what she did. And now I am telling it to paper so that it will be somewhere when I am not. So, the country was the Brindle Valley, high plains broken by Cedar Wash, which ran brown in spring and dry as a bone by August, and my place sat where the wash made a slow bend, and a man could water stock without hauling. It was a good place. My father had broken it and I had built it up. And by the year I am speaking of I ran more cattle than any outfit between Ostrander and the Breaks, and I had a frame house painted white when most men still lived in soddies and dugouts, and I had 2 children, Sam who was 9 and quick and angry, and Lucy who was 6 and quiet and watched everything, and I had not had a wife in 3 years. Ellen had died in the spring. I will not put down the particulars because they are hers, and because I have learned that grief is not made smaller by being explained. It is enough to say that she went in 2 weeks from being the warmest thing in that house to being a name we did not say at the table, and that I had loved her since I was a boy of 19 leaning on a corral rail watching her come up the road, and that when she was gone I did the thing a stubborn man does, which is to decide that the loving was the thing that had broken me, and that I would not do it again. For 3 years I hired girls from town, and they did not last. A house with 2 motherless children and a man who did not speak at meals is not a place a girl wants to stay, and one by one they went home to Ostrander with their wages and their stories. By the 3rd year the place was clean enough on the surface and rotten underneath, the children half wild, Sam getting into fights at the schoolhouse, Lucy not speaking above a whisper to anyone but the dog, and I knew it could not go on, and a man who will not feel a thing will reach for a practical solution to it the way he'd reach for a tool. So I had Crandall, who ran the mercantile and knew everybody's business in 3 counties, put it about that I was looking for a wife of a sensible sort, a widow preferred, a woman who could cook and keep and was not afraid of work, and that I was not a young man with romance in him, but a steady one with a good place and 2 children who needed a mother's hand. I would not put a thing like that in the paper with my name on it. Crandall knew folks who knew folks, and after a time word came back through that web of frontier knowing that there was a widow down at the railhead decent, had run a farm, lost it, had no people, and would consider an arrangement. We did it all in letters, hers in a small upright hand, and we did not pretend in them. I told her plainly what I was offering and what I was not, and she told me plainly that she could cook on a wood stove and put up enough garden truck to feed a family through a hard winter, that she had buried a husband and was not looking to be anybody's sweetheart, and that she would deal honestly with my children and expected to be dealt with honestly in turn. We were two people making a hard bargain across 100 miles, and there was something almost restful in how little either of us pretended, and I told myself I had found exactly the thing I went looking for. The wedding was a justice of the peace in Ostrander, 15 minutes, Crandall and his wife as witnesses, and then the long cold ride out to the place with this stranger beside me on the wagon seat and the children's faces in the window like two pale moons. That is the morning I began with, the morning in the yard. I had said my hard piece because I wanted the lines drawn before we ever crossed the threshold, and she had told me she'd come for ground and not for love, and she'd carried her own bag up my steps. And so we began. The first week she went about the house the way a careful person goes about a borrowed thing. She did not move my furniture or my dead wife's dishes. She cooked plain and well, and the children ate, even Sam, who had taken to picking at his food like it was an insult somebody owed him an answer for. She learned the house in a day and the children in 3. With Lucy she did not push. She set a stool in the kitchen where the warmth was and went about her work and let the girl watch. And within the week Lucy was handing her clothespins at the line and telling her, in that whisper, the names of all the chickens. With Sam it was harder. Sam was a small furious copy of his grief, and he tested her the way a colt tests a fence, and the day he called her a name no 9-year-old should call a woman, I came in from the corral ready to take a strap to him, and she put a hand flat on my chest, the only time she had touched me, and said quietly, "He's not testing you, Mr. Mercer. He's asking me if I'll go like the others did. Let me answer him." And she did, not with sweetness and not with the strap, but by simply not going, day after day, until the boy ran out of meanness to throw at a person who would not leave. And one evening I came in and found him sitting on the kitchen stool with his head against her arm, asleep. And she looked up at me over the top of his head with a look that said nothing at all and everything, and I went back out to the barn and stood in the dark a while. I am getting ahead of the garden. The garden is the heart of it, so let me come to it the way I came to telling her about it, which is to say late and badly. Behind the house, on the south side where it caught the morning and was sheltered from the worst of the wind by the smokehouse and a windbreak of cedars my father had set, there was a piece of ground about 40 feet square that had been Ellen's garden. In her time it had been the prettiest thing in the valley and the most useful, both at once, which was like her. She'd had it fenced in pickets against the rabbits and laid out in straight beds, and she grew everything, beans and squash and onions and potatoes for the table, and a long bed of corn and herbs by the kitchen door. And along the south fence she kept flowers that had no use at all except that she liked to look at them, hollyhocks taller than Lucy, and a tangle of sweet peas, and a rose bush her own mother had carried west as a slip wrapped in wet cloth. When she got sick the garden was just coming up, and when she died nobody touched it, and it went a weed that first summer, and the next, and by the time Marta came it was 3 years gone to ruin, the pickets gray and falling, the rosebush a thorny snarl, the beds lost under a felt of dead grass and bindweed, the whole of it a square of wreckage I could see from the kitchen window and did not look at if I could help it. I had never plowed it under. A practical man would have. It was good ground going to waste, and I told myself a dozen springs that I would set the hand to it and turn it back to pasture or break it for more potatoes, and a dozen springs I had not, and if you had pressed me on why I could not have told you or would not have. It just sat there behind the house, dead, fenced mine, and I had told Marta the second day, walking her around the place, that ground's not to be touched. She had looked at the wreck of it a long moment, at the rose bush and the fallen pickets, and she had said nothing, only nodded, and I thought that was the end of it. It was not the end of it. I came in late one evening near the end of that first month, having ridden the North Line all day in a wind that scoured a man down to nothing, and I came around the smokehouse the short way, and I stopped. The dead grass was gone off the near corner of Ellen's garden. Somebody had been at it, had cut and pulled and hauled away the felt of bindweed off a strip maybe 6 feet by 10, and turned the black ground under, and the broken pickets along that side had been straightened and tied up with twine, and there in the raw turned earth, in a neat row, somebody had set out little plants. Cabbage starts by the look, with a tin can of creek water beside the row for the watering. I stood and looked at it and felt a thing come up in me so fast and so hot I did not have a name for it. It was anger, I told myself. She had been told. I had said the words plain as I knew how, that ground's not to be touched, and she had nodded, and here she had gone behind me in the long evenings when she thought I was out on the range, and dug into the one piece of that whole country I could not bear to have anybody's hands in. And I went into that house with the wind still roaring in my ears, and I found her at the stove, and I said her name in a voice that brought both children up out of their chairs. She turned around with the spoon still in her hand, and she did not look frightened, which somehow made it worse, and I said, "I told you that ground was not to be touched." And she said, even in quiet, "You did." And I said, "Then why is it dug?" And she set the spoon down, and she sent the children to the other room with a look, and she stood facing me across that kitchen, a small woman in a brown dress with creekwater eyes, and she said a thing I have carried for 40 years. She said, "Because it is the best ground on this whole place, Mr. Mercer, sheltered and sunned and watered, and it is dying for no reason, and I cannot stand in that window every morning and watch good ground die for no reason. I have watched enough things die that didn't have to." Her voice did not rise. "You can send me back. You'd be within your rights." I broke the word I gave. "But I will tell you true, I would rather you sent me back than I lived here 3 years like the man before me, and let that ground go on dying out the window where I have to see it. A thing that can grow ought to be let grow. That's the only law I ever cared much about." And I stood there with my anger in my hands like a tool I'd brought into a room where there was nothing to fix with it, and I could not say a word, because she had named the thing. She thought she was talking about the garden. She did not know she was talking about my whole life, the house and the children and the man, all of it good ground gone to weed out of a grief I would not put down, and she had said it to my face without knowing she'd said it, and I turned around and walked out into the dark, and I did not send her back. I did not tell her she could have the garden either. I am ashamed of that now. I was not a man who could say a generous thing out loud yet. But the next evening when I came in, the cabbage row had a second row beside it, onions, and I said nothing, and that was how she knew. That was the whole of my blessing on it, a silence, and she took it, and she went to work on Ellen's garden the way she did everything, without fuss and without stopping. An hour stolen here in the morning before the bread, an hour there in the long light after supper, the children trailing after her with cans of water once Lucy worked out it was allowed. I want to be honest about what that was for me, those first weeks of watching her work that ground, because it was not sweet. It was hard. Every strip she cleared was a strip Ellen had cleared before her. Every bed she opened, Ellen had opened. When she straightened the pickets, I remembered Ellen's hands on them. And when she got down to the rosebush and stood looking at the thorny snarl of it with her hands on her hips the way you look at a hard job, I had to go to the barn, because that rosebush was Ellen's mother's, carried west wrapped in wet cloth, and the thought of this stranger's hands in it was more than I could carry, and I leaned on a stall and breathed like a man who'd run a long way. But here is the thing I did not expect, and it is the center of the whole of it. She did not pull the rosebush out. I half thought she would. It was the worst-looking thing in the garden, 3 years of dead canes and thorn and no green in it that you could see. A practical woman clearing ground would have grubbed it out and burned it. Instead, I watched her, evening after evening, work at it the slowest and most careful of anything she did. She cut away the dead canes one at a time with a pair of shears down low, and she did not cut a one until she had scratched its bark with her thumbnail to see was there green under it. She found green under it. Down at the root, under 3 years of dead, the thing was alive. She cleared the dead away to give the live a chance, and she dug in around the roots and watered it, and she built a little ring of stones to hold the water, and she did all of it for a thing that gave her nothing back, not a leaf, not for the longest while. And one evening I could not help it. I came and stood at the broken gate, and I said, the first thing I had said to her about the garden that was not anger, I said, "That one's likely dead. You're wasting your time on it." And she did not look up from the shears. She said, "Most everybody thought so." A pause. "There's green at the root, Mr. Mercer. As long as there's green at the root, I don't call it dead. I call it waiting." And then she did look up, and she did not say anything pointed. She was not that kind. But she held my eyes one beat longer than the words needed, and then went back to her shears. And I went back to the house with my heart going like a colt in a chute, because I had understood her exactly, and I knew that she had not meant the rose, or had not only meant the rose. And that somehow in the space of a month, this woman I had hired to cook had got down past 3 years of dead cane to wherever it was the green was at the root of me, and was clearing the dead away one careful cut at a time to give it a chance, and had the patience to do it for a thing that gave her nothing back. I did not sleep much that night. The summer came on. In that country summer is a hard, fast thing. The green of June burned to brown by August, and a garden is a war you fight every single day against drought and grasshoppers and the sheer meanness of the high plains, and Marta fought it and mostly won. I will not pretend I helped her at first. I was a busy man with 1,000 head and a short crew, and I told myself the garden was hers and her business, and I rode out at first light and came in at dark, and the garden grew, or didn't, on its own. But a man notices things even when he's pretending not to. I noticed that the food at my table changed. Where before it had been plain beans and salt pork and biscuit, the food of a house with no garden, now there were greens, and new potatoes no bigger than marbles boiled with a little butter, and peas, and the children ate them like they were starved, Lucy with a green smear on her face and Sam reaching for seconds without scowling, and I understood that they had been hungry for something I hadn't known how to feed them, and it had been growing in the ground out back the whole time we went without. I noticed that Lucy got a little plot of her own, a square at the end of a bed, and that Marta let her grow whatever foolish thing she wanted, which turned out to be pumpkins, 3 hills of pumpkins that took over Lucy's whole square, and then a good deal of the path, and that Marta did not pull them up for taking too much room but staked out the path with sticks and let the child's pumpkins sprawl. And I watched Lucy out that window every evening going from hill to hill on her hands and knees talking to her pumpkins. This child who 3 months before had not talked above a whisper to a living soul, and I had to set my coffee down. I noticed that Sam, who had no plot and would have died before he asked for one, took to carrying the heavy cans of water for her without being asked, and that she let him, did not thank him too much or make a thing of it, just let him be a person who carried water for someone, which is a thing a furious boy needs more than he needs to be told he's good, and that his fighting at the schoolhouse fell off and then stopped. And I noticed her, is the truth of it, the way she'd push the hair back off her forehead with her wrist because her hands were full of dirt, and the way she stood at the end of a finished row to look at it with a plain satisfaction, and the way she talked to the children out there low and steady, and the way the whole of her seemed to ease and open in that square of fenced ground in the evening light in a way it did not in my house, where she was still careful, still a borrowed thing, still keeping to the lines I had drawn that first cold morning. She was at home among the rows. She was a guest under my roof. I had drawn that line myself, and I began, that summer, to hate it. The turn, I have thought a long time about when the turn was, because there is always a moment a thing turns even if you can't see it till later. The turn was the evening of the storm. It came up out of the southwest the way they do, a wall of black cloud with a green sick light along the bottom of it, and I knew hail before I smelled it, and I came off the range at a dead run because hail in that country can kill calves in the open and flatten a season's grass in 10 minutes. I got the stock as sheltered as a man can, and I rode for the house through the first of it, the leading rain cold as a knife, and as I came around the smokehouse there she was. There was Marta in the garden in the storm. She had Lucy's pumpkins under wash tubs and the cabbages under the wreck of an old door, and she was throwing burlap over the bean rows, and she was working in that wind with her skirt plastered to her and her hair down out of its pins streaming across her face, fighting for that garden against the sky the way I'd seen men fight a grass fire. And the hail started, the first stones the size of peas and then bigger, and I came off my horse hollering at her to get in the house. Get in, leave it. And she turned, and she had a streak of mud across her cheek, and her eyes were lit up like I had never seen them, and she hollered back at me over the wind, "Help me or get out of the way." And I do not know to this day what came loose in me. 3 years of being a man who would not feel a thing, and a woman in a hailstorm with her hair down telling me to help her or get out of the way, and I helped her. I grabbed the other end of the burlap. I hauled the old door over the tomato vines and held it against the wind while the hail came down on the back of my neck and my hands, and we got the worst of it covered, the two of us, soaked through and pelted. And then it was too hard to stand in, and I caught her by the arm and pulled her under the lean-to roof of the smokehouse, and we stood there pressed up out of the worst of it, breathing hard, watching the white hail bounce a foot off the ground in the green light over everything. And her shoulder was against my arm, and neither of us moved it. When it slacked, we went out into the wreck. Hail had got the corn, beat it flat, and stripped half the bean rows we hadn't reached, and the flowers along the south fence were broken sticks, and she went from bed to bed in the gray afterlight taking the count of what was lost the way I'd take the count of a herd after a bad night, not crying, just reckoning, and I walked it with her. And at the end of it she stood in front of the rose bush. The rose bush had come through. It was the only thing along that whole south fence the hail hadn't smashed, because it sat in the lee of the smokehouse, and in the months of her careful tending it had put out new canes, green and whippy, and on the new growth, that very week, it had set its first buds in 3 years. A half-dozen tight green buds just beginning to show the red, and the hail had spared everyone. She stood in the wet looking at those buds, and she put one finger out and touched one, light as anything, and she said, not really to me, "There it is then. It was only waiting." And I looked at her finger on that bud, Ellen's mother's rose that I had not been able to bear another woman's hands on, and I felt no grief at all, only a kind of high clean ache like the air after the storm, and I knew, standing there soaked to the bone in the ruin of my dead wife's garden, that I had told a lie that first morning in the yard. I had told her I'd married her for the house and not for love, and that the account was closed and the ledger burned. And it was a lie. There was green at the root, there had been all along, and she had found it. I did not say any of that. I was still a man who could not say a generous thing out loud. But that night, after the children were down and she sat at the table mending by the lamp, the way she did, I did not go out to the barn the way I always did to be alone with myself. I sat across from her with a piece of harness I was pretending to oil, and I stayed, and after a while I said, looking at the harness and not at her, "That corn'll come again if we replant within the week. There's time before frost for a short crop." A pause. "I'll break you another piece of ground for it, north of the pickets. I've got the team idle Thursday." It was the smallest thing. It was nothing. A man offering to plow a furlong of dirt. But she knew what it was, that it was the first time I had said we about the garden, the first time I had offered a hand instead of a silence, the first time in 3 years I had volunteered to put a plow into ground next to Ellen's. And she set down her mending and looked at me a long moment across the lamp, and she said, "Thank you, Wade." And it was the first time she had said my name without the Mr. Asterisk. And the sound of it in that quiet kitchen went through me like the first warm day goes through a winter. And I said, "You're welcome, Marta." And we sat there in the lamplight not saying anything else. and I have had a great many fine evenings in a long life, and I am not sure any of them was finer than that one. But I would like to tell you it was easy after that, that the wall came down all at once, and we fell into each other and were happy. It did not go like that. A wall a man builds over 3 years does not come down in a night, and I put up more fight against my own happiness that next while than I am proud of. There were days I felt the warmth coming up in me and got frightened of it and went cold and short, and rode out without a word, and left her in a house gone quiet, and I would see the hurt of it cross her face before she put it away, and I'd hate myself on the range all day and come back no better at saying so. I had loved a woman once and lost her, and it had near killed me, and there is a kind of man, and I was him, who decides the safe thing is to never stand in that wind again, and that man fights hardest right when the thing he wants is closest, because the wanting is the danger. It was the children in the end who would not let me keep the wall. Lucy harvested her pumpkins in the fall, 3 of them big as wash tubs, and she could not pick them up, and she came running to me where I was working in the lot, this child who had been afraid of me for 3 years, and she grabbed my hand in both of hers and pulled and said, "Pa, come see what I grew, you have to come carry it." And I let her pull me out back to the garden, and there was the pumpkin, and there was Marta straightening up from the bean rows to watch us come, and Lucy said, "Carry it to the porch, Pa, so everybody can see." And I picked up that child's pumpkin and carried it to the porch with the child dancing alongside, and Marta watched the whole of it with a look on her face I will not try to name, except to say it was the look of a person watching a thing they have worked at a long time come true. And I set the pumpkin on the porch rail, and Lucy threw her arms around my leg, and over the top of her head I looked at Marta, and Marta looked at me. And I think we both knew the bargain was finished. There was no bargain left in that yard. There was a family. And still I did not say it. Lord, I was slow. It was Sam who said it for me that winter in his furious sideways way. We were in the barn, the 2 of us, mending tack by lantern, and the boy was quiet a long time, and then he said, not looking up from the bridle, "She's not gonna go, is she?" Not a question the way he said it. And I said, "No, son, she's not going to go." And he worked at the bridle a while, and then he said, "Lo, good." And that was the whole of it. But I understood that my son, who had tested her for a month with every meanness he owned to find out if she would leave, had decided she would not, and had given her his whole battered heart on the strength of it, and that I was the only one in that house still holding out, still keeping to a line drawn one cold morning by a man who had been wrong, and I put down the tack I was mending, and I knew I would have to find a way to say the thing. I am not a man for speeches. I found my way to it the way I found my way to most things, through work, through the ground. That next spring, we had come a full year by then, a full turn of the season since the cold morning in the yard. That next spring I got up before her one morning before light, and I went out to the garden, and I did a thing. I had been thinking on it all winter. Along the south fence where Ellen's flowers had been, the ones the hail had smashed, the hollyhocks and the sweet peas she had grown for no use but that she liked to look at them, I dug the bed over and I set it out in the dark, by feel and lantern, with seed I had ridden all the way to Ostrander to get from Crandall's wife, who kept a flower garden and knew me when I came in red-faced and asked for it like a man asking for something illegal. I am not a hand for delicate work. I expect I did it badly. But I dug Ellen's flower bed and I planted it, hollyhocks and sweet peas, the useless beautiful things, and I did it because I had worked out over the long winter what it was I wanted to say and could not, and it was this, that I was not asking Marta to be Ellen, and I was not asking her to forget that Ellen had stood in this ground. I was asking her to grow her own beautiful useless things in the same good earth where another woman had once grown hers, because there was room, because the ground was deep enough for both, because a garden is not betrayed by being planted again. I could not say that, so I planted it. She found me out there at first light, dirt to the elbows, the lantern guttering, the bed set, and she stood at the gate in her shawl and looked at what I had done, and she understood it. I watched her understand it. Her hand came up to her mouth, and she came across the garden to me between the beds, careful of the new set rose the way she was careful of everything that was trying to grow, and she stood in front of me, and I said the speech I had, which was not much of a speech. I said, "Marta, I told you a lie the first day. I told you I married you for the house." I had to stop. I'm no good at this, but I'd not have you stay on for a bargain. I'd have you stay because, and I could not get the rest of it out, the word after 3 years I could not, and she put her dirt-streaked hand flat on my chest the way she had that first month with Sam, and she said gently, finishing it for me the way she finished everything I started and could not. "Because there's green at the root, Wade. I know, there has been all along, I've been tending it." And then she smiled, and it was the first time I had seen her whole face open the way it only ever did among the rows, only now it was opened at me, and she said, "I'll stay. Not for the bargain. I tore the bargain up a long while back. I'll stay because I want to, which is the only way a thing's worth staying." And I took her dirty hand off my chest and held it in both of mine in the cold spring morning. And that was our wedding, the real one in the garden, the first one having only been the paperwork. I kissed her among the rows with the lantern guttering out and the light coming up gray and then gold over the cedars, and I will leave it there, because what came after a man keeps for himself, and because it is enough to say that I came into breakfast that morning a different man than the one who had ridden out a year before, and the children knew it before I said a word, the way children always know, and Lucy crawled into my lap at the table, which she had never done. And Sam looked at the two of us, and at his sister, and went red and pleased and furious all at once in the way of a boy who is happy and would rather die than show it. And Marta stood at the stove with her back to us a moment too long, and when she turned around she had been crying, and she was laughing too, and she said, "Eat your breakfast before it's cold, the lot of you," which is the closest she came to a wedding vow, and was, I have always thought, a better one than most. I said I'd set this down whole and honest, so I will tell the rest of it true, because a happy turn is not the same as a finished story, and the years that came were not all garden mornings. There was the hard winter the second year, when the cattle market broke, and a banker out of the territorial capital, named Holcomb, came out to the place in a buggy with a paper, and the smell of a man who wants to take a thing while it's down. We had borrowed against the herd to buy more ground in a good year, the way everybody did, and the market had fallen out from under us, and Holcomb held the note, and he sat in my parlor and told me in a regretful voice that was not regretful at all that he would have to call it, that times were hard, that he was sure a sensible man would understand, and that he could offer me, of course, a fair price for the place, and a fair price was about a third of what the place was worth, and we both knew it. And he knew I knew it, and that was the kind of man he was. I am telling this part because of what Marta did, and because it shows the kind of partner the bargain had bought me, that I had not had the wit to want. I sat across from Holcomb getting hotter and closer to a thing I'd regret, a man whose whole life was being taken in a parlor by a fellow in a clean collar, and Marta came in with the coffee, and she set it down, and she did not leave the room the way a woman was supposed to. She sat, and she said in her even Creekwater voice, "Mr. Holcomb, before my husband answers you, might I ask, the note comes due in March, does it not?" And Holcomb, surprised, allowed that it did, and Marta said, "And the terms allow for payment in full or in part to be made any time before it falls due, with no penalty for early payment." I read it. It's in the 3rd paragraph. Holcomb's face changed. He had not expected the wife to have read the 3rd paragraph. And Marta said, "Then we won't be needing your offer on the place, but I thank you for the coffee company. We'll have the note paid before March." And she stood up, which meant the meeting was over, and Holcomb looked at me and I looked at him, and I did the smartest thing I have ever done in my life, which was to keep my mouth shut and let my wife run a banker off my porch. When his buggy was gone, I said to her, "Marta, we can't pay that note by March. There's no way on earth," and she said, "There's a way. It won't be a pleasant winter, But there's a way, and I'll show you the figures tonight, and we are not selling this ground to that man for a third of its worth while there's a breath in either of us. And there was a way. She had been keeping the household books since the first month. I had handed them to her with the other work without thinking. And she knew the place's money better than I did, knew where it leaked, and she had a head for a hard plan. And we sold off the increase and culled deep, and lived that winter on garden truck and salt pork and not much else. And she put up the garden so heavy that fall that the cellar was a wall of glass jars. And we did not buy a thing all winter we could make or grow or do without. And in March, I rode to the Capitol and paid Holcomb's note in full and watched his face. And I want to tell you that the satisfaction of it was very nearly the equal of the relief. That is the kind of thing the bargain bought me. I had gone looking for a woman to cook and keep my house, and I had got a partner who could read a banker's note to its third paragraph, and save my place with a garden and a ledger and a will like a fence post. And I had near thrown her warmth back at her for the better part of a year out of a grief I would not put down. There is no fool like a grieving man, and no luck like the luck of being married to a patient woman who tends the green at the root anyway. There was sorrow, too. I will not pretend there wasn't. We lost a baby, our first together, before it was born in the third year, and that was a dark season. And I learned in it that the bargain truly was finished and the marriage truly was made because we grieved it together, the two of us, where the old me would have gone cold and silent and out to the barn, and she would have grieved it alone among the rows. We did not. We grieved it together in the dark of our own room, and it bound us closer instead of breaking us, the way the right kind of sorrow does. And the next year she gave me a son, Eli, who is 51 years old now and runs this place. And after him came the girls. And the house that had been a clean, rotten, quiet thing filled up with noise and life the way the garden had. And I am not able even now to think on the whole arc of it. The dead, quiet house, and the dead, quiet garden, and the dead, quiet man. All three of them brought back by the same patient hands, without having to stop and look out the window a while. But she has been gone 4 years now. I will set that down too, because the story is not honest without it, and because I am an old man and not afraid of the saying any more the way the young man in the yard was afraid. She went in the winter in her sleep, easy, which is more than most of us get and more than she'd have asked for herself. And she was 80 years old and we had been married 51 years, and I have learned the second time what I learned the first, that grief is not made smaller by being explained, and so I will not explain it. But I will tell you the difference, the whole difference, between the man who buried Ellen and the man who buried Marta, because it is the thing she taught me and the only wisdom I have to leave, and it is this. When Ellen died, I let the garden die. I stood at the window and watched good ground go to weed for 3 years because I had decided that the loving was the thing that had broken me, and I built a wall, and I let everything behind it go to ruin, the ground, the children, the man, and I called it safety, and it was the closest thing to a slow death a living man can manage. That was my answer to losing a thing I loved, to stop the loving and let the green at the root go untended, and tell a stranger in a cold yard that the account was closed. When Marta died, I went out the next morning to the garden. It was January and there was nothing in it but the bones of last year, but I went out, and I cleared a bed in the cold with my old ruined hands, and I have kept that garden every year since, badly, the way I do, and the children fuss at me for it, an old man on his knees in the dirt, and I let them fuss, because they do not understand, or maybe by now they do. The rosebush is still there. Ellen's mother's rose, that Marta found the green at the root of in our first month and would not call dead, would only call waiting. It is 50-odd years old now and big as a haystack, and it blooms every June like a thing that has never heard of dying. And I cut the first rose off it every year, and I take it out to the 2 graves on the rise above the wash, where they lie side by side. The 2 women who tended me, the one who broke the ground and the one who would not let it lie fallow. And I put the rose between them, because there is room, because the ground is deep enough for both, because I learned at last that a garden is not betrayed by being planted again, and neither is a heart. I married a woman to run my house. I told her the first morning that I had wed her for the house and not for love, that the account was closed and the ledger burned, and she told me she had come for ground to stand on and not to be loved, and we were both of us lying, only we didn't know it yet, the two of us standing in a cold yard, each guarding a thing we thought was dead. There was green at the root. There is almost always green at the root, if a person has the patience to clear the dead away one careful cut at a time, and the faith to water a thing that gives nothing back for the longest while. She had that patience and that faith, and she spent it on a ruined garden and a ruined man both, and she made us bloom, and I never once in 51 years found the words to tell her the size of it. So I am telling it to paper, while the hand still works, in the long light of an evening with the rose blooming out the window and the wash running low and gold, and the place she saved still standing white against the cedars my father set. I married her for the house. I want that written plain because it makes the rest of it true. And then she made the dead garden bloom again, and the man with it, and there is no part of my long life I would call my own that she did not first plant, and tend, and coax up green out of ground I had given up for dead. That is the whole of it, and it is the truest thing I know.